What's going on, guys? Scar coming at you with another Magic the Gathering video. Today's video, we're going to be diving into some decks that I think may make a presence in the meta as a whole. Each one of these decks are fairly interesting, and as Kaldheim has kind of released, these are some decks that have kind of popped up as I've seen over the course of some weekend tournaments, as I was doing some research to kind of find some new decks that kind of, have a new flavor to them. Overall, each of these decks are kind of unique in their own way. Some of these decks are kind of decks that kind of existed, but with the help of Kaldheim for a few cards, these decks I think could have a place to compete in the overall meta as a whole. With that being said, guys, if you like the video, hit that like button. If you're new here, want to know post new videos on the channel, hit that subscribe button. But let's dive into the decks and let's talk about each one. So the first deck up on the list is a Naya Adventures deck, and I think Naya Adventures was kind of a thing, but it was kind of missing something to compete with Temur Adventures, and I think this now, with the help of Kaldheim releasing and getting some new pathways to kind of help our mana situation, as well as getting one particular card in the set overall, which is Showdown of the Scalds. I think this deck actually compete alongside of like something like Temur Adventures and actually make a presence in the meta, just because it actually has a fairly good curve overall, and it has a good idea of what it's trying to do, especially with the way the current meta is set up. But we'll go by each card, kind of talk about each one, kind of about how it works with. Sure, you guys already know what Adventure is. If you don't know already, it's this thing from Throne of Eldraine. Essentially, cards have two things. They can cast like a spell on one side and the creature on the other side, and we get the benefit of playing Adventure cards and getting more card draw by playing Edgewell Innkeeper, because whenever we play a creature spell that has Adventure, we get to draw a card. So he's kind of like our way to keep our hand full until we get to something like Great Henge, which is something that costs less, equal to the greatest power amongst creatures, where X is the greatest power among creatures we control. It produces mana for us, and then whenever creatures come into the battlefield, a non-token creature comes into the battlefield, they get a +1/+1 counter, and we get to draw a card. So with that being said, this deck is actually, like I said, fairly interesting in what it's trying to do. Besides Edgewell Innkeeper, in the one-drop slot, we are playing Giant Killer. The overall idea here is it can be a 1/2 with the ability to tap things down in the later game if we're just trying to get some damage. But if we're also, it has a destroy target creature with power 4 or greater, so it kind of stops the decks that have some top things, which is going to be fairly good against like some decks that I think pop up as well, like Giants and stuff. This is definitely going to be a card that's going to be able to take out some powerful things for 3 mana, which is definitely very good, and then get the benefit of the creature on the other side. In our true drop slot, we are playing Embereth Shieldbreaker. It's a 2/1, 2 mana, has a sorcery ability for 1 mana to destroy target artifact, which I think is good. So against a mirror, or sometimes just playing a bunch of artifacts, even Embercleave, it's good to have an ability to destroy just an artifact straight up. With that being said, it is fairly good, I think, in what it's trying to do. The value is there, so 2/1's pretty solid. Scavenging Ooze is also another card in the deck. It is a 2 mana 2/2. It allows us to exile things from our graveyard and our opponent's graveyard, just in case we're playing against something like rogues. It helps us kind of like in the deck a little bit, get rid of things that our opponent may return back. Or in other decks, if our opponent's playing escape cards, this will help us eliminate those escape cards for 1 mana and allowing him to get bigger. Then we have Brushfire Elemental for a little bit of that aggro aggressiveness. Is a 2 mana 1/1. Sure, the first turn it comes out, it's probably more likely a 1/1 if you're playing on turn 2. But every time we play it, combine that with Fable Passage, this thing can get pumped up, and then it can't be chump blocked by things that are power 2 or less, so it actually gets through for a lot of damage, especially in the early game, and definitely can overwhelm your opponent to get them down really low pretty quickly. But overall, a very interesting card for this overall setup. Next card up is Shatter Skull Smashing. The reason why we play this is, one, because it has the land on the one side, but the other benefit too is in the later game, if our opponent's starting to establish a field, we can always tap it for 2 red and X, and either do split damage amongst multiple 2 creatures, or we can do X damage to 1 creature. And if we pay 6 or more, that damage is doubled. So in the late game, we can almost eliminate almost any creature for the most part, unless it's something really large. But overall, a very good card to help us pick off things on the board that we really just don't want there. Follow that up with Bonecrusher Giant. I mean, what else can I say? I mean, any deck that plays red, I feel like plays Bonecrusher Giant. It's just an overall very good card. 3 mana 4/3, with the ability to also be like a 2 mana shock spell that damage can't be prevented. So just overall solid card on what it's trying to do in the format, and has that multiple ability, so it can ping things and also be a very large creature for our opponent to deal with. Lovestruck Beast, yet again another adventure card that you've seen plays in Temur or Mono Green Food. It's just a solid card that has produces a 1/1. On top of it's a 3 mana 5/5. But overall, very solid card. Even if we don't have a 1/1, it's still a 5/5 blocker that our opponent has to attack into if they can't remove it. So it's definitely something that gets in the way, even if we can't attack with it. Then we got Kenzandu Mammoth. Yet again, another card that has modal, so we can play it as a land if we really need green mana. But the benefit of it is we have a 3 mana 3/3 with a landfall ability that it's really large, and helps us also like maybe play into something like a Great Henge, because if we play it on turn 3, turn 4 we play another land, goes up to a 5/5, Great Henge costs 4, we then play Great Henge, then we have more mana open. So overall, very good synergy card with our deck and what we're trying to do here. Now we got the new card from Kaldheim. This card's actually really strong. The first ability is strong in the sense that we don't really have an ability to kind of dig a little bit deeper into the deck just based on the colors we're playing. So the first ability allows us to kind of look at the top, have the top 4 cards of our library exiled. We can play those cards up until our next turn, which is very good because even if we can't play anything on the turn we play this, we have an extended hand that is exiled that our opponent can't target. And then the second benefit is whenever we cast a spell this turn, we get a +1/+1 counter on target creature we control. So essentially, as we start playing things out, we have another way of putting counters on things to make our creatures that much stronger. And then we can target whatever creatures we want. So that's, I think, another good thing. And then this happens for 2 turns. So eventually, if our opponent can't do it with our creatures can become very large, and we're just going to be swinging for massive amounts of damage. Then we got Vivian, which is another good card here, on the basis of 1, it produces creatures, which is always great. So it helps us with things with reach in case we need, block things in the air. The second ability, I think, is why it's really good in this deck, is because a lot of our cards in our deck are creatures, and the ability to look at the top card of our library at any time, and we can cast creatures from the top of our library. So essentially, it just gives us another way to kind of dig a little bit deeper into our deck to cast more creatures to kind of overwhelm our opponent. The whole idea of the deck is really just to get wide and just get really strong big creatures that our opponent just can't really deal with. And like I said before, the Great Henge is in the deck. Very solid card in that sense, just because it helps us just make our creatures that much stronger by giving them +1/+1 counters. And on top of it, it has a draw mechanic, so it allows us to draw in the deck that normally, with the colors we're playing, doesn't really draw a lot. Embercleave is just a big finisher. If we get our opponent into a situation, we can get a big creature with the Embercleave on them and pretty much swing for lethal at that point. It just makes it very awkward for our opponent to block into, just because we have a lot of creatures that, you know, combine that with landfall or just like something like a Love Strike Beast plus this. We have a 6/6 double strike trample guy. It's definitely very hard for our opponent to deal with. Also, you know, it has some, you know, if you haven't played Embercleave, it becomes cheaper the more creatures we have attacking, so we can get very aggressive in our attacks once this is out in the battlefield. And like I said before, the land base is actually fairly strong. We do play 2 cards that are also model lands, but we have 1 plains, 2 mountains, 4 forests. We have 4 pathways of red and green. We have the red and white pathway. We also have the Needle Verge, the Boulder Fist pathway, which is green and white, and then we have the Fabled Passage to kind of round out the mana. Like I said before, this is, I feel like, a deck you're going to see a lot of, just because I think the deck is very explosive, and I think it could overtake the Naya Adventures deck just because we're allowed to play something like Shoulder of the Scalds. It just kind of creates that little bit of more momentum as we do play more things on each of our turns. So the next deck up on the list is Izzet Tempo. This is another interesting deck here because Izzet's kind of always been a thing in the meta as a whole. There's the version of it where you have things that have you know, whenever we play a non-creature spell, it gets +1/+1 counter, and then we have the Blue Dragon from M21 that whenever you play a creature spell has a ability called Prowess, it gets +1/+1. But overall, this one's more of like a spell focus with, we're playing very select creatures. I think we're only playing 12 creatures in the deck, which is a Goldspan Dragon, which is a 5 mana 4/4 flying haster. Whenever it attacks or becomes target of a spell, we get to create a treasure token, which allows us to kind of produce a little bit more mana. That we can sacrifice to produce 2 mana of any one color, which is amazing because, you know, 2 mana of any color can really cast a lot of spells in our deck, because a lot of our spells are 2 mana. We have a lot of 2 mana spells. We have some 4 mana spells. We have some 5 mana spells, and so on and so forth. But just having the ability to produce that mana is great in that way. And, you know, it's whenever it attacks or becomes target, so it's kind of really weird to have to deal with it, other than having to block outright. We're also playing Frostlands in the deck, so we can play something like Frostbite here, which is a 1 mana shock essentially to target creature or planeswalker. If we control 3 or more snow permanents, it deals 3 damage instead. So with 1 mana, 3 damage spell is always good. Then we play the Standful Stroke, which is just a way to counter things very large for 2 mana. Essence Scatter for creatures, Essence Negate for non-creatures, the Shatter Skull Smashing, you know, for some board removal, because, you know, the deck essentially doesn't really have a lot of things to deal with board wipes. Sure, we can play things that are kind of clunky, like, you know, that also hit our board by playing something like we can kind of play something clunky like Storm's Wrath, which essentially hits all our creatures, which definitely sucks because we don't want our creatures to die, because our creatures really don't have more power than 4. So we're playing like Shatter Skull Smashing just to be more targeted and be able to target what we want. In the 3-drop slot, we're playing Brazen Borrower for the bounce effect and also the flyer, and after we play the bounce effect. Saw It Coming is a very interesting counterspell because sure, our opponent may see it coming, but essentially they have to either play into it if they don't think we have it. But you know, it's just an additional counterspell in the deck, and it counters any spell, either for 3 mana or if we foretell it for 2 mana and then 2 mana when we actually cast it, counter whatever. Like I said before, Bone Crusher Giant. If it's a red deck, you probably will see this card. It's just a very solid card all around because of its 2 abilities. Behold the Multiverse is actually a very good card, I actually think, for what it does. Sure, it's a 4 mana at instant speed, draw 2 cards, and also scry first. But I actually think it's even better to set this up as a, set it up for the foretell cost and then later play it when you really need the 2 cards to get the tempo going. I think the idea of being able to scry and then draw on the cards is actually really, really good. And I think for the cost, it's actually fairly good. Like I said before, Goldspan Dragon, it's kind of like the meat and potatoes of the deck because this allows us to create tempo by creating more lands. That allows us to kind of play more things, which essentially keeps our tempo going. And of course, we're playing a lot of non-creature spells, so Shark Typhoon makes the list. Whether we cast it outright in the 6 mana cost and create, whenever we cast a non-creature spell, we get those tokens every time, or we can cycle it in the early game if we really need something to kind of stand in the way of what our opponent's trying to do. Mana base, like I said before, is pretty straightforward. We play 8 snow-covered islands, 3 snow-covered mountains, some red-blue pathways, Volatile Forge in the deck, Fable Passage to help filter the mana, and Faceless Haven, which I actually think is going to be the better snow land, I guess, essentially for creatures, because as much as we play the card from Zendikar that we can tap 4 mana, put 2+1/+2 counters on it, and then become a creature. I think this one's great because the creature has vigilance, so after we even attack in with it, we can actually tap it down for mana to produce, use for another spell, which I think helps it overall in that sense. So with the release of Kaldheim, I think Rakdos, it has always been a thing, but I think this helps Rakdos kind of bump up. So this is like a Rakdos mid-range style deck. Overall, I think the thing that helps it out overall is that we have a way to play an untapped land that's red and black to help filter our mana in the way that we need to, which definitely helps out. Sure, we also still play Temple of Malice, which is okay, helps scry the top card, but the pathway just helps it overall better. As we draw into our lands, we can kind of pick and choose what mana we need. It's playing like a typical Rakdos thing, but there's some new cards in here from Kaldheim that I think help the deck overall become annoying to play against, but I think this is something you're going to see a lot of. I think it has done fairly well over the weekend in some tournaments that has ran, but we had in the 1-drop slot we have Village Rites, which goes well with the next card I'm going to go over, but the ability to cast, sacrifice a creature, draw 2 cards is very good. If you actually put a hold on your turn as you cast something like Kroxa and have the 1 black mana open, you can actually sacrifice Kroxa to it to get the 2 cards as you play Kroxa, which is also a very good little trick. But combine that with something like Claim the Firstborn as well. You can take your opponent's thing, Claim the Firstborn, or Village Rites, your creature you took from your opponent, and then get 2 cards that way, which, you can even take their own creature and attack in with it, unless it's a wall. But overall, that's something that's a very good combo in general, good synergy in that way. Next up is Mire Triton, 2 mana, 2/1 with Deathtouch, helps us fill things in our graveyard to help, get to our, Kroxas, or just get things in the graveyard so that we can sacrifice it to other things that require us to get rid of things in our graveyard. And we also gain 2 life in the process. And a 2/1 Deathtouchers makes a very awkward opponent to want to block into, just because Deathtouch, just kills any creature no matter what the power is. So definitely something that makes our opponent attacking very awkward. Valky of the God Lies, or Tybalt, is a new card from Zendikar Horizon. I think both sides are actually fairly good. You got the early game Valky, and then you have the late game Tybalt, depending on where you are in the situation. But I think the idea here is that when he enters the battlefield, each opponent reveals their hand, which for 2 mana gives you information of what your opponent's trying to do. You get to exile a creature card from their hand, and then afterwards, if you have the mana to as you exile it, you can tap X and choose a creature card, exile with Valky, look for mana cost X, and come copy that card. So essentially, whatever's underneath Valky, it becomes that creature. On top of it, I think the other idea too, taking something that your opponent really needs, maybe for their synergy or their tempo, is also very good. Sure, it's only a 2/1, but if you take something that's kind of on the cheaper side, you can pump them up to something bigger. Definitely something very interesting. And like I said, Tybalt's also good for the late game because he's a 7 mana planeswalker, which is kind of expensive, so he's a late game spell. But the idea here is when he enters the battlefield, you get an emblem that whenever you play cards, whenever you exile cards with Tybalt, the Imposter, you may spend mana as though it was mana in any color to cast those spells. So essentially, if we do the +2, we get to exile top card of each player's library, whether it's ours or our opponent's. Now we get to cast any of those spells that may have been exiled that way. We have a -3 here to exile target artifact or creature, so another card that we can also play added that we exiled. And if we get to -8, we can exile all cards from graveyard and add 3 red mana, which essentially means any of the cards that are in exile now are essentially playable by Tybalt based on using these abilities. So overall, very solid card just because it has a two-way thing. I think the modal lands are the modal cards in Kaldheim have been pretty impressive just because they have two spells essentially you can do with them, which makes them very strong. Like I said, Kroxa, he's that Rakdos card that is very essential to a Rakdos deck. The idea here that for 2 mana you get to play it. Sure, you have to sacrifice it, but your opponent has to discard something. They discard a land card, or they don't have a card to discard. They lose 3 life, and then on turn 4 we can escape him for 2 black and 2 red, and essentially do the effect again, which is very good, and it empties our graveyard out a little bit, especially against something like rogues that is prone to throw things in the graveyard. It's a very good card to actually overall play. Next card up is Egon of God of Death, 3 mana 6/6 with Deathtouch. At the beginning of our upkeep, we exile 2 cards from our graveyard. If you can't, we have to sacrifice it and draw a card, which is not terrible, but 6/6 on turn 3 is very awkward for our opponent to deal with, especially with Deathtouch. So essentially, it's a very strong card in that sense. On top of it, we can also play it for its modal card, which is a 1 black mana legendary artifact. At the beginning of our upkeep, we get to mill a card, so card with a built-in mill, and for 3 mana, we get to exile a creature card from our graveyard and get to draw a card. So both sides very interesting here. You can always play Throne of Death early, and then if we draw another Egon, we can always play the Egon as we have things in our graveyard. So you can pick and choose what you want to do here, but I think it's overall a pretty good card for being a rare. Timur Calls the Dead, just another card that helps fill our graveyard, helps us cruise 2/2 black zombie creature tokens to kind of get an early start. That happens every turn. And when we get to chapter 3, we get to gain X life, or X is the number of zombies we control. We have quite a few zombies in the deck, which make it very good. Outside of the ones called by Timur, Mire Triton's also a zombie, and it can get in some life and get to scry and kind of fix the top of our library, especially Woe Strider as well. Woe Strider is another thing that if we do something claim the first one, we can always sacrifice the thing we claimed to scry the top card. We can escape it as well to empty our graveyard out, and whenever it escapes, it gets +2/+2 counters. But overall, just a good card to help fix the top card of our library. Like I said, deck's playing red, more than likely play Bone Crusher Giant. So Bone Crusher Giant, I can't say any more about it. Just a very good card, has 2 solid abilities. Kazu's Fury is actually very interesting here on the basis of, one, if we do something like Kroxa, we can also sacrifice Kroxa to Kazu's Fury to do 6 damage at our opponent. So it's definitely pretty good in that sense. And on top of it, if we really need a red mana source, we can always play tap. But overall, pretty good card. A Crone War, yet again another card where we take something of our opponents. We get to control it as long as Crone Wars are on the battlefield. Force our opponent to attack with things maybe they don't want to attack with. And then every time each tap creature deals damage to itself equal to its power. So essentially on chapter 3, we're untapped and our opponent's still tapped down, possibly from the forced attack. All those creatures are going to be doing damage equal to their power to themselves, so possibly killing themselves. But overall, strong card there. Okay, Immersturm the Predator. It's a 4 mana 3/3 with flying. When it becomes tapped, exile up to 1 target card from graveyard, put a +1 counter on it. We can sacrifice another creature. It gains indestructible to end of turn, and we tap it. So essentially, it has an ability to become indestructible, which is fairly good. So it's hard to remove in that way, especially if it starts going. Our opponent really can't, destroy it with a target destroy spell. They'll have to figure out a way to either bounce it or exile it in that sense. And the mana base, like I said before, has become a little bit better in the sense that we have more lands that come into the battlefield untapped, which makes the deck play smoother. We play 7 swamps, 4 mountains, 4 blade steep pathways, 4 Temple of Malice, and 4 Fable Passages. Overall, this deck is fairly good. When I did play with it in some play games, just to kind of get a handle of the deck, when I kind of got to like turn 3, turn 4, and I was playing some of my early game, it just made opponent scoop. So I don't know if people just don't want to deal with us taking things and sacrificing them, especially when they're trying to get their tempo going. Who knows? But I could see definitely this deck being the next popping up in the meta as a whole. Now this next deck is something that I think is going to be in the meta. I don't know if it's going to be a top tier deck, but I think this with Kaldheim, I think this deck has kind of gotten that next ability, and that is a Golgari Deathtouch. Essentially what it is before Kaldheim came out, the idea here was get a lot of Deathtouchers in the deck and play some like Hooded Blightfang, because whenever we attacked him with a creature that had Deathtouch, we pinged our opponent automatically for 1 life and we gained 1 life, and then whenever it dealt damage to Deathtouch, deals damage to a planeswalker, destroy the planeswalker. So the deck is still doing that, but we got a couple new cards from Kaldheim that kind of make this overall deck better. We're still playing Falmir Knights for the 1/1 Deathtoucher, or in the later game, we can always pay 3 and draw a card and lose a life. We have the Tarju Blightblade just because it's a 1/1 Deathtoucher. Mire Triton because it's a Deathtoucher for 2 mana, it helps us gain a little bit of life. We have Fynn, which is the new card that kind of helps out the deck overall. It's a 2 mana 1/3, which makes it already pretty solid. Sure, there's a lot of removal in the set now that you can do 3 damage to something, but I think the idea here is whenever a creature we control with Deathtouch deals combat damage to a player, that player gets 2 poison counters, and when a player gets to 10 or more poison counters, they lose the game. So it gives our Deathtouchers kind of that thing that our opponent either has to block them or our opponent's gonna have to start stacking up damage, poison counters, which is actually fairly interesting here. And for 2 mana, I think that's a very solid ability. Sure, it's the only way that we really can do poison damage, but if we do get it out very early, our opponent's going to be in a very tough position because 10's less than 20, so it's a lot easier to win that way. Playing some ram throughs because things with Deathtouch, no matter what their power is, as long as they deal damage to something, it's just a good way to kind of kill something that we just don't want for 2 mana. We have Shovel, which takes benefit of it being a 1/3 for 2 mana, and that's being of our upkeep to put a bounty counter on target creature. If that creature dies, we get to draw a card and gain 3 life, which is very good. And with Deathtouch, you know, makes it very awkward. Combine that with poison, our opponent's going to start blocking with things on the board, so definitely things are going to start falling off the board. Call the Death Dweller to get all our cheap Deathtouchers back out on the battlefield. The Deathtouch kind of really doesn't matter because all our creatures for the most part have Deathtouch. But it gives maybe one of our Deathtouchers Menace, which is actually fairly good, especially if our opponent doesn't play a lot of creatures. So, you know, it makes blocking awkward against Deathtouchers. Combine that with Fynn, we're going to get some easy poison counters. We got Egon of God of Death, just because yet again, Deathtoucher, 3 mana for 6/6 is very good. We can also play the Throne of Death, which helps mill things, to help us draw things if we have Egon out. And if our graveyard does get filled with things, we have things, you know, exile to hopefully keep them on the battlefield. If not, it gets sacrificed, but still pretty good. Hood Up Lifing still in the deck because yet again another alternate win condition, so it's either Fynn or Hood Up Lifing help us really get there for the win. We got Valgroth, Bloodsky Sire. It's a 3 mana 2/3 with Deathtouch, and we can boast it whenever it attacks or after it's attacked for 2 mana, and target player searches their library for a card and shuffles their library, puts it on top of it. So essentially it has a card to get us something we really need. So either play this, attack in with it, opponent either destroys it or blocks into it, or we get to tap 2 and that will search our library either for something like Fynn or even Hood Up Lifing, depending on what we need. We can find a card that we really need with that ability. Grim Dancer, because we can give it a Deathtouch counter, give it Menace, give it Lifelink, depending on whatever we need. Actually pretty good for 3 mana. Nighthawk Scavenger, 3 mana plus 1+ whatever the card types in our opponent's graveyard, and 3 toughness, flying Deathtouch Lifelink. So that's definitely something hard to attack into because it's flying, it has Deathtouch, it has Lifelink. Academia's Awakening in the late game, if a lot of things have died, we can always tap it out to get all our things back that we want for, you know, 7 mana or so. Vengeful Reaper is very interesting here. You would be like, why would you play an uncommon that's 4 mana for a 2/3? But the idea here is we can always set it up with the Foretell for 2 mana, then flip it over and play it onto the battlefield whenever we decide to need it. And it also has haste, so you know, it's very good that way. And things with flying and Deathtouch is very few and far between, so it's definitely something that's kind of unique, just like Nighthawk Scavenger, to get that free damage in, because a lot of times people aren't playing really flying unless they're playing some blue and things like that. So definitely good in that sense. Then you got Questing Beast, which is a solid card overall, 4 mana for 4, Vigilance, Deathtouch, haste. Can't be blocked by things 2 or less. Has a mess of text on the card itself. But overall, it's just there to kind of, you know, be aggressive, and our opponent has to either block it or just take it, and then we get to block. You know, we can use it as a blocker even after attacking. And the idea that it can deal damage to a planeswalker if our opponent, you know, has one out on the battlefield, if we just attack our opponent's face, still for 4 damage, is very good as well. Also, the next card here that's actually very interesting, if we get this also with Fynn, this becomes very interesting. But it's a 6 mana 6/6 Trample Haster. No Deathtouch, so it's besides the fact. But if we put one or more counters on a permanent or a player, put twice that many counters of those kinds instead. So essentially here, Fynn puts 2 poison counters. This would double essentially, so every time we deal damage with Deathtoucher that we have Fynn out and this out, we essentially be putting 4 per damage dealt to our opponent. And if our opponent would put 1 or more counters on a permanent or planeswalker, put half that many of each of those counters on that player planeswalker, round it down. So anything that gets a counter, if it gets a single counter, it would get 0 counters. So essentially stops +1/+1 counter things. So essentially a very interesting card here to kind of slow our opponent down from trying to go off on anything that would pump out counters. Mana base is pretty straightforward, playing Castle Locthwains for some additional draw in case we need to dig a little bit deeper to get to some certain cards. Playing Snowlands just because Snowlands are okay. We're not really playing anything really snow specific other than I think no, I don't think there's anything snow, but so I mean, worst case scenario, you can always get rid of the snow permanents. But Snow's kind of okay. No one's really playing like the mono white deck and having the tax out, but it could eventually evolve, so you can always swap them out if you just want regular lands. We have the Pathway as well, and with the Chasm for some more Snow. But overall, pretty straightforward deck, and it's kind of, you know, very interesting. I think it's gotten better just because we got more cards to kind of help out Deathtouch and become a thing. So this could be a deck that pops up. I don't know if it's going to be top tier, but it's going to be something I could see being in the meta as a whole. With that being said, guys, I mean, these were some interesting decks that I found to be kind of interesting in overall tournaments over the weekend. These are things people are playing. We'll kind of see how Kaldheim develops with the current meta. These tournaments did have decks from the current meta, so it's not like these were just tournaments that had new decks. And these were from various tournaments. So with that being said, if you'd like the video, hit that like button. It definitely helps out a lot. If you're new here, want to know I post new videos on the channel, hit that subscribe button. But I'll catch you in the next video.